how do people behave when the stakes are high? How do they behave when they're under threat of death, when their third of their yearly salary has been stolen, when they're trying to build a new society? There's only one way to get that answer, and that's to look into the historical archives. And it's a new challenge. I don't think scientists know. We don't have good ideas about how people behave in these really extreme environments. On the 19th of October, 1801, John Martin, a laborer, got paid. And he got paid actually about 5 guineas, which was a significant fraction of his yearly salary. So you should imagine this young man walking through the streets of London with perhaps on the order of $10,000 pounds in his pocket. It's hard to do the conversion. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he meets a friend of his, and in his own words, had a little bit too much, not unexpected. That evening, he's walking through Well-Close Square. Here it is. Neither of these are contemporary images for John Martin, but where he met a young woman called Mary Hall. And in the records from the Old Bailey, he says he asked her how much for a bed for the night. It may not surprise you. It did surprise me. I thought this was like an Airbnb thing. It turns out no, actually. He was paying for more than just a night on a soft mattress. John Martin and Mary did their things. In the morning, John wakes up and he feels under his pillow for his trousers, into which he has stuffed whatever remains of his 5 guineas after a night on the town. They're still there. He goes to the toilet to, as he says, evacuate himself. And when he comes back, he finds Mary Hall rummaging under his pillow and in his trouser pocket for money. He seizes Mary Hall. They get into a scuffle. There's a cry. In through the door comes a man with a knife, and in fact, behind him, his wife, apparently. John Martin is held at bay with a knife, and then, as he says, a second man comes in with a pair of tongs and starts beating him as they're wrestling for whatever remains of the 10 grand that he brought with him. John Martin loses. He is kicked down the stairs. They let him put some of his clothes on, and they throw the rest out the window. So we know about this story in large part, in fact entirely, because of the work that Tim and his colleagues did to produce the Old Bailey online, a record of the trials that passed through the Central Criminal Courthouse in London. The trial itself, and the trials, they're unbelievable to read. They can give you nightmares or they can make you laugh. The nightmarish ones we can talk about if you like. The ones that make you laugh are a lot easier to talk about, and this one is funny, but it also has many of the emotions and feelings and sensations that are entirely plausible to us. The greed of Mary Hall, the lust of John Martin, the intemperance of John Martin, indeed, the anger and viciousness of whoever showed up to pull off the rest of the crime that John Martin then brought before the judge. But one thing that is strange about that moment in the Old Bailey is the fact that as John Martin describes what's going on, he seems completely unashamed, by the way, of having laid a prostitute. He is really delicate about going to the toilet in front of the court, but he seems to have no problem talking about what he and Mary Hall were supposedly meant to be doing. But what surprises, I think, the most is that this person, John, reports in front of the most significant agent of the state that he may have encountered an incredibly violent crime, a crime where he was threatened, where he was assaulted, where he was beaten with tongs, it turns out, metal tongs. And yet, that violence seems to go unremarked. The crime itself, Mary Hall is tried for, is the crime of grand larceny. The same crime she would have been tried for if, for example, she had simply taken money out of his pocket without him noticing, or taken money through an open window. And the difference between how people perceived the kind of violence that John Martin was subject to and that Mary Hall and her companions perpetrated, the difference in how that was perceived in 1901 to today is a gulf so enormous that it's actually hard to imagine. So today, for us, the biggest distinction between crimes is the distinction between a violent crime and a nonviolent crime. So imagine, for example, your friend is caught shoplifting. Your natural response, certainly my natural response, I won't ask you, although I will have some audience participation later if you don't My natural response is, of course, just to ring her up and say, what's going on? Obviously, I'm so sorry, can I pick you up? Are you depressed? What's going on? Let's have a cup of tea, let's talk about it. But imagine that a friend of yours is in a pub in London and gets into a fight, smashes a pint glass on the side of a table and slashes someone's face. You will probably reevaluate your friendship. And in fact, the magnitudes of the crimes and even the intentionality of the crimes don't seem to matter. So imagine, for example, a friend of yours runs a big laboratory here at Sussex and is caught embezzling £10 million, impugning people's careers, perhaps, harming the university, making it harder for everybody to get a grant. Okay. 10 years down the line, maybe you've forgiven him. But imagine a laboratory head that gets angry at a graduate student one day and shoves him. And in fact, even accidentally, say that person falls over and breaks his leg. Our response, our visceral response to a man who breaks someone's leg, even accidentally, is of a completely different order, a completely different quality to the response that we might have to somebody who commits a crime that we might even call it, say, even a victimless crime or a crime, financial crime. That distinction did not exist in 1801, certainly not in the way that it exists today in 2016. And part of this story is something that was told by the man Norbert Elias in what he called the civilizing process. The civilizing process is a long-term secular shift away from violence and involving not just the emergence of safer societies, societies in which we could live without the threat of violence that existed for our ancestors, but a vast system of interconnected norms and hierarchies of beliefs that separate violence out, the violation of someone's bodily integrity out from other kinds of crimes, from other kinds of norm violations. So Elias, he developed this argument in part, it's a lovely book to read, he developed this argument in part by close readings of etiquette texts from the 14th and 15th centuries. And it's by reading these etiquette books that you can realize that the world of the 15th century, let's say, is a very different one from today. So one of the great pieces of advice, right, is, it's like when you're having dinner, if you need to go to the bathroom, don't just get up and pee in the corner. That's rude, right? So by studying these etiquette books, he was able to track how people's behaviors and also their attitudes towards those behaviors changed over time. So this is, I would say, classic history in a mode that has been familiar to us. This book was written in the 20th century, but a classic form of history that involves reading closely and telling a story about how you perceive the minds of people who died long ago. The close reading that Elias did was influential, certainly. But you might say that violence begins, in fact, when people run out of words, that you won't find the signal of violence or the signal of changing attitudes towards violence in etiquette books. And in fact, really, we began to pay attention to Elias's arguments only when we saw a graph like this. This is the homicide rate for Europe. Each of these dots is a different data set here. This is gathered by Manuel Eisner. This is a paper in 2003. I came across it, in fact, of course, talking to Tim, who introduced me to these arguments, but also is part of the main argument of Steven Pinker, who wrote a book in 2011 called The Better Angels of Our Nature. This is the homicide rate per 100,000 people from the 1200s all the way up to the present day. And the main story here is the fact that over the course of those 700, 800 years, the chance of you dying violently, the chance of you being murdered, drops by a factor of at least 100, if not more. And in fact, this curve keeps going down. There are blips, of course, in the curve. A way I tell this to my students is if the homicide rate today, or if the homicide rate in 1250 was the same today, at Indiana University, we'd have about 40 students murdered a year. It's an incomprehensible world in many ways. It's a shift. This long-term trend is something actually we don't see that often in history, something that takes this long to unfold. For example, we take, after 1350, the Black Death, right? So in parts of Europe, maybe 1 in 3 people are gone, right? So economic historians will tell you that the response to this is that wages grow up, that wages go up, that a British bricklayer, for example, makes twice as much as he did the year before. Okay? That shift in wages goes up. and then drops back down. And so in fact, there is no long-term secular trend, let's say, in how much in terms of pounds of corn per year you earn as a British bricklayer. There is almost no change between 1450 and 1750. And so this long-term trend is something profound. It's not just a story of cultures changing. So it's a story, the story that you can tell with demography is one thing, but because of the archives that we've created now, we can do more than just count the bodies. And so the three stories I'll tell you today, the three pieces of research, and I'll begin with the Old Bailey, and you can see here, flowing up here is Mary Hall and John Martin. What I'll tell you is that there are more things in the world than we can quantify than we thought. There are more kinds of facts in the world that history has to wrestle with. I'll be telling you about facts about the emergence of signals in different societies over time in 18th century Britain and 19th and even 20th century Britain, and then, in fact, during the French Revolution. We're familiar with some facts, right? What we can quantify. We can quantify biological facts, biometrics, right? Calories in and calories out, genotypic and phenotypic variations. We can quantify demographic facts, birth and death rates, mortality curves, the demographic transition. These are all facts that history has to wrestle with. If you have an account of how history works that doesn't take these into account, that predicts something else for what should be happening here, that's inconsistent with these facts, your historical interpretation must fail in some way. We have economic facts, economic history, the history of salaries and prices, so I told you a little bit about that, currencies, velocities of circulation, distributions of wealth, the emergence, let's say, of inequality. Okay. But our final term, what I'll talk to you about today, is that there is maybe a fourth kind of fact, an epistemic fact, facts about signals and information, facts about the reliability of those signals and the capacity of those signals, facts that are fundamentally cognitive. They're fundamentally facts about how people might perceive events and phenomena in their environment and form beliefs on the basis of what they see. What people could potentially perceive and form beliefs about in their environment. So we're going to quantify epistemic facts in this talk. And when we do that, we have a problem, which is that we don't know how to quantify thinking. We have no way to put a mathematical formula to describe the very, very messy process of how people think. We don't know how to do it yet. We know that we use all sorts of heuristics. Basically what we know is that you put people in a cognitive science lab and there's really no telling what they're going to do. So when we come to quantify epistemic facts, when we come to quantify facts about signals in the environment, what we're going to do is we're making an approximation, okay? So this is like the fallen human world, right? This is the world of common people. This is our world, how we think. Okay? We don't know how to describe how an individual thinks. But remarkably, we are able to describe how an optimal reasoner thinks. And so what I'll tell you is a series of facts about how what we call the Bayesian angel works. How a being with potentially infinite capacities would, in the presence of imperfect information, reason. Okay? So what we're going to do, in other words, is we're going to reverse engineer the angel. I'm going to tell you how an optimal reasoner will work, and then I'm going to set her loose on the archives that Tim and his colleagues collected for us. Okay? So we know this. This is deductive logic. We know how to reason deductively perfectly. Okay? This is something we've known since Aristotle. So if A is true and B is true, then it's also necessarily the case that it's not the fact that not A or not B, right? Are you with me? Okay? So we know how to do this. In fact, computers can do this, right? But most of the kind of reasoning we do is not deductive in nature. It's in fact inductive in nature. So most of the time we encounter events in the world, we're not faced with a problem of a priori logical necessity. We're faced with problems like this, right? Okay, so I'm here, I see a bird. For some reason I want to know something about it. I say, look, most birds can fly. That's a bird. Bird can probably fly. Not deductively true, okay? But still a good piece of reasoning. And it wasn't until the 20th century, really, that we were able to put all these pieces together and tell a story about what we call Bayesian reasoning. So Bayesian reasoning is the optimal way to combine bits and pieces of imperfect knowledge, okay? Bits and pieces of imperfect knowledge to come to the optimal conclusion, to form the most reliable belief. And in fact, we know this in part through a number of different people who put this story together over the course of many centuries. I learned it, in fact, from this guy here, E.T. James, who is no longer with us. I never met him. He's a real bruiser, right? So E.T. wrote a book essentially saying that Bayesian reasoning, or rather a certain way of manipulating probabilities, which many different fields had independently discovered. So the economists had discovered this, the psychologists had discovered this, the cognitive scientists had discovered this. James pointed out that, in fact, all these together were doing exactly the same thing. Interestingly, actually, so one person who worked on this problem and didn't quite get it was John Maynard Keynes. The problem of forming beliefs in the presence of uncertainty is not as easy as it seems at first. And in fact, Keynes actually had a bit of a problem with the idea of quantifying uncertainty. So is it going to rain today, right? I don't know. I'm uncertain. And in fact, what James says is that you can put a number on that uncertainty. If I'm in California, my uncertainty about whether it's going to rain is probably pretty low. It's probably not going to rain. If I'm in Sussex, apparently my uncertainty is pretty high. Keynes actually had this problem. He says, sometimes I take my umbrella and I don't know how uncertain I am. Okay? And so that's where he got stuck. And James just says, forget it. You are uncertain. You just aren't willing to admit it. Okay? So at the core of modeling the optimal reasoner, okay, is a method for quantifying the information in a signal. And so I'll describe to you how we can quantify this, how we can talk about how uncertain an optimal reasoner is in their environment. Has anyone played this game, Animal, Vegetable, Mineral? It's like the car game, right? Your parents played with you, right? 20 questions, right? So this actually, this is maybe a sort of pro-free market story I'm going to tell. This was actually a game on Polish communist television, a game show, where they would get sort of representatives, they get the plumbers union up, and this televised game show where they would have to guess. They play the Animal, Vegetable, Mineral game. And, so it's like, what am I thinking of, comrade? So the Animal, Vegetable, Mineral game, they eventually brought the Polish mathematicians up on the show. And they had 20 questions. And the Polish mathematicians said, OK, first question. Is the word that you're thinking of in the first half of the alphabet or the second half of the alphabet? And they say, OK, it's in the first half of the alphabet. OK, is the word you're thinking of in the first half of the alphabet or the second half of the first half of the alphabet? And what, of course, they had done was solve the 20 questions game without having to think. Okay. So the story goes then, right, that at that point, the game show is shut down and the mathematicians disappear, never to be seen again. So it turns out that if you're trying to guess a word, if you're trying to guess the word I'm thinking of with a series of yes-no questions, it's a pretty good heuristic to just split the alphabet in half, but you can actually do better than that, in fact, in part because there are more words in the first half of the alphabet than there are in the second half of the alphabet. So let's imagine, we'll walk you through some real basics of information theory. Let's imagine you're playing the game of 20 questions, or Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, okay, with your dad. And you play this over and over again on the world's worst car trip ever. And you know that your dad is thinking of only one of three things, right? He's either thinking of a tree, a bird, or a car, okay? And half the time he's thinking about a car, a quarter of the time he's thinking of a tree, and a quarter of the time he's thinking of a bird. Okay, so if you were trying to end this game as quickly as possible, what is the first yes-no question that you ask? Well done. Okay, you have beaten Colorado and you're keeping up with MIT. So the optimal question here is it a car, right? If yes, okay, game over. You've finished the game in one question, right? If no, unfortunately, the game has to go another round, right? Okay, fine, is it a bird? In fact, equivalent, you can say, is it a tree? Because once you answer that question, you're done, okay? So the average number of questions, okay, that you need to ask in an optimal sense, right? So you constructed this optimally, right? So my colleague here has correctly guessed or correctly reasoned out that you should first identify the car. So if you ask the optimal tree of questions, right, you have the optimal script, okay, then on average it will take 1.5 yes-no questions, okay, to figure out what this person is thinking about. And that 1.5 number, we actually call that a bit. That's 1.5 bits. And that is, in fact, the uncertainty you have in your father's choice of these three options. Okay? Your dad could be more uncertain. So for example, imagine if he's thinking of the car only 1/3 of the time, so this was evenly balanced. Now you finish quickly only 1/3 of the time, and then the other 2/3 of the time you have to split a second time. Okay. So in fact, this is the story of information theory. It lies at the heart of how we encode information on computers. When you zip a file, when you gzip a file, what you do is essentially create an optimal question tree for your particular Microsoft Word document. What's amazing to me is that Claude Shannon in 1945, in the process of developing a theory for how the telecommunications network should work, actually figured out that this mathematical formula here, okay, and we'll come back to this mathematical formula here, where P is the probability of event X, okay, tells you the average number of yes-no questions. So you don't even have to construct the optimal tree in order to know the uncertainty of the process. Okay? So this, if you don't freak out about information theory, this is the one equation that you need to understand or to measure the uncertainty in a process. So let's, for example, say that you're in California and it never rains. Okay? So the probability of it being sunny is 1. The probability of it raining is 0. Okay? So then you have 1 log 1, which is 0, and then you have 0 log 0, which turns out to be 0. So your uncertainty in California is 0. You're precisely certain about the weather in California. Let's go to Sussex and say it rains half the time. I don't know if that's true. Now you have 1/2 log 1/2 plus 1/2 log 1/2, and in fact that number turns out to be greater than 0. You are now uncertain, being in Sussex, about what the weather is going to be. And in fact, your uncertainty then is 1 bit. So in the course of this talk, what I'm going to be doing is measuring probability distributions in historical archives, measuring the levels of uncertainty that optimal reasoners would encounter, and making, at the end, a historical argument which I urge you to tear apart. I will sometimes slip up because many different fields have come across this same thing. So Shannon invented this, but then a bunch of physicists realized that he was doing exactly the same thing, except they were calling it entropy. Okay? So I will sometimes say the information in a process, I will sometimes say the uncertainty, and I will sometimes say entropy or disorder. All of these words here mean only one thing, okay, which, if you like, you can cash out as the number of yes-no questions you need to figure out what's going on. Okay, so I can do this with anything, right? The car game, right? Okay, is it going to rain in Sussex? But I can do it with Pride and Prejudice. So all I have to do is turn Pride and Prejudice into a probability distribution. So what I'd like to imagine, okay, is you have this big bag. You take Pride and Prejudice, right? You chop it up into the words, right? And you stick your hand in the bag, okay? And you pull out of the bag a word. You don't know what word it's going to be. You're going to be uncertain about that word. And so there is some uncertainty in the word choice of Pride and Prejudice. So, if I might ask, what is the uncertainty of a word in Pride and Prejudice? How many yes-no questions do you need, on average, to figure out the word that you've pulled out of the bag? This is called pedagogy of the awkward. Is it higher than 1 bit? Okay. Does someone want to take a stab? There are prizes. Ooh, you're killing me. 9 bits. This is really interesting. Well done. Okay. God, you're reading Pride and Prejudice, I guess. All right, so look, right? What does that mean? 9 bits, 9 yes or no questions. Okay? So you pull out a word, right? It's like, okay, I got a word, Tim, and Tim might say anything. He might say, is it a noun? And I'm like, yes. And he might say, is it a proper noun? And I say, yes. Is it Mr. Darcy? Yes. Okay, fine, right? You win, right? Now, Tim has a script, right? In fact, like the actual script you would need to get on average 9 yes or no questions for Pride and Prejudice is some script that we can't even construct, right? It's going to be some bizarre thing where it's like, is it a member of this set or that set, right? It's not going to be a human readable script. Okay. Interestingly, if you think about it, 9 bits is actually not that much. 9 yes or no questions only gives you, if each option is equally weighted, only gives you in the end 512 possibilities. Pride and Prejudice has a larger vocabulary than 512. But if I read to you exactly, okay, let's take the first line of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So when we hear that, we hear words like universally and acknowledged, but in fact the majority of language is these little filler words, right? It is a, that a, in, of a, must be in, of a. Most of the words in Pride and Prejudice are drawn from this very small set, right? So basically the first question Tim should ask is something like, hey, is it one of those definite articles or something? So the richness of Jane Austen is a little bit hidden here. It's in that long tail of all those remarkable words that she uses and puts together. Okay, so, right, so now you can do the uncertainty of Pride and Prejudice word by word, right? Okay, so let's do something else. We can think about my uncertainty about a word in Pride and Prejudice. We can measure it, right? All I did to do that was take all the words in Pride and Prejudice, get the probability of picking each one out, running it through this formula here, summing over all the words that she uses. But I can also talk about my uncertainty about a word that she's going to use, given knowledge about something else, right? So if I know something, okay, about the word, then my uncertainty will go down. And in fact, one thing I can think about is how uncertain am I about a word in Pride and Prejudice if I know the word that came just before. So I stick my hand in the bag, I pull out a word from Pride and Prejudice, right? I don't know what it is, okay? But then let's say I tell you the word before is the. Well, now you know it's not going to be a verb, okay? So your uncertainty about what that word is has gone down. So you can think of it another way, right? Which is that this word here has given you information or reduced your uncertainty or served as a signal of the word that comes next. You can see Pride and Prejudice as this stream of information flowing from one word to the next. If I hear one word, it gives me a signal. It reduces my uncertainty of what's going to happen next. Okay, so the entropy of Pride and Prejudice, the uncertainty about the next word you're going to see is 9 bits. Well done. Okay. But my conditional uncertainty, the uncertainty of a word given the word just previous, is 5.41. Okay, so what that means is that the mutual information of consecutive words in Pride and Prejudice is on average 3.65 bits. So I get sort of 3.65 free questions if you tell me the word before. Okay. One word signals the next. Okay. Okay, so anyway, when I did this, I do this as a teaching example, right? I can't resist. Okay, do a little quick science, right? So this is Jane Austen writing Pride and Prejudice, okay? So let's take another great work of literature. Let's take To the Lighthouse, okay? What is the entropy of words in To the Lighthouse? Higher or lower than Pride and Prejudice? Higher. Actually, it technically is higher. It's actually within error. That's remarkable, right? They're using completely different words, right? There's no motor cars in Pride and Prejudice, right? Okay? Using totally different words, but actually the overall uncertainty in word choice stays the same. Okay, here's a better question, right? What does the mutual information do in To the Lighthouse? The mutual information between one word and the next. How much one word signals the nature of the word that comes after. Is it higher or lower? Low. Ooh, well done. You guys are good. Yeah, it's lower, right? Virginia Woolf's text is, in some sense, less predictable. It's sending fewer signals. You see a word, and it doesn't give you quite, it gives you some information, but only gives you 2 3/4 of a question, not 3.65, okay? So hopefully this is giving you a sense that when we quantify the signals in a system, it's actually telling us something significant about a really human product. Information theory is about more than just pumping information down a wire, okay? So I'll do one more example, okay? So these are internal signals, right? How uncertain you are about a word, okay, and then how uncertain you are about the word given that you've heard the one just before, right? So this is the sort of strength of the signal from one word to the next. These are sort of internal signals in the system. Let's think about external signals. So I usually, at this point, I usually do the House of Congress, but instead we'll do a British example here. So here's the thing, right? Let's imagine you read a political manifesto. And you hear one word out of that manifesto. Okay? How much information, how much of a signal does that give you about the party that produced the manifesto? Okay? So let me put it this way, right? Labour or Conservative. There are many parties in England. I'm just going to do these two, okay? Right? I'm going to give you a clip from a manifesto, and I need you to tell me, just yell it out, okay? Labour or Conservative. Britain needs a new economic model. Labour or Conservative. Saving and business investment must replace reckless borrowing as the foundation of growth. All right. Oh, interesting. You said Tory. That'll come up in a second. Okay. Anyway, there you go. That's from the 2010 Conservative Manifesto, Invitation to Join the Government of Britain. Okay, here's another one. Okay, and this is an older example. And where will the money come from? Ooh. Interesting. Where will the money come from? Some of it will come from those oil revenues pouring down the drain. Some of it will come from the billions we waste on the dole queues. Some of it will come from the billions now being allowed to be exported and investment abroad. Yes, and some of it will be borrowed. Labor. Mrs. Thatcher's dirty word, right? Okay, good luck with that election, right, guys? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take all the manifestos from year to year, beginning in the 1960s. We can do this because somebody actually in Germany pulled these together. It's the Manifesto project. We're going to pull all these manifestos together, and we're going to look at the signal strength distinguishing the Labour and the Conservative Party on the basis of their manifestos, right? So I have a manifesto. I don't know which party wrote it. I see one word from the manifesto. How much information does that give me about which party wrote it? The higher that number is, the more distinguishable the parties are. Okay? How much information about party affiliation is contained in a single word? Okay? Equivalently, how much does my uncertainty decrease if I know which party is speaking? Right? It's like, hey, Tim, what are you reading? I'm reading borrowing. Ooh, sounds like a conservative document. Okay? So here we go. Maybe you know how this ends. Okay? 1960 to 2010. Okay? So here is over time, this is decreasing distinguishability, or equivalently, as you go higher, the parties are more distinguishable, the manifestos are more distinguishable. So here we begin, this is the 1960s and early 70s, right? It's kind of fluctuating around, like, this year here they were more distinguishable, this year a little bit less. It's an interesting moment, this is 1974, they had 2 elections in the same year, okay? So this is the first manifesto, Labour couldn't quite get a majority. So, okay, in October of the same year, their next manifesto looks a little bit more similar to the Tory one, right? Okay, so they get a little closer. Right, then things sort of idle along in the 1980s. Okay, so what happens next? Yeah. New Labour. The distinguishability of the Labour and Conservative Party manifestos drops. It drops significantly. It's never been closer in the history, at least, that we have of their manifestos here. Okay, so that's actually, it turns out it happens in 92. They don't call it New Labour until the next election in, what, 98? Sorry, 97, thank you. What happens after? This is an interesting question. What happens after the landslide election for Tony Blair? Sorry? That's what I expected too. It actually goes up, interestingly. I guess like they got close, they took all the voters, and now they're free to develop their own image again. So what we see here is a story about how these parties are creating signals, okay, and increasing or decreasing their strength over time. It's a little fun game. Which are the strongest, and we'll see this in the Old Bailey, which words are the strongest signals of affiliation, okay? So some words are really helpful for distinguishing the parties, and some words are not. We can rank them. So if I hear the word the, it turns out both parties use the definite article, okay? But here are the signals of a Labour document, 1964 to 2005. So all you guys who said Tory, okay, I know who you voted for, right? So words like public, development, policy, plan, program, industry, prices, okay? Whereas signals of a conservative document, tax, taxes, choice, state, give, help, much, money, need, law, okay? Police, actually, civilizing process. And finally, just because it's possible to do this, let's look at the signals of old versus new Labour, okay? So now I've given you a manifesto. I've told you, I'm going to tell you it's a Labour Party manifesto, okay? And now you have to guess, right? Is it old Labour or new Labour? So the signals of old Labour, sort of up until the 1992 election, signals of old Labour, government, labour, industry, prices, okay? Signals of new Labour, so starting in 1992, children, the sterling pound sign, and crime, okay? And it's literally the pound sign that serves to distinguish new Labour from old Labour. So I call this, right, bairns, bucks, and brigands is new Labour, at least under this. These are the signals, these are the words that help you distinguish the two manifestos the most. What that means is that they're common, they're used a lot, and when they're used, they're helpful in splitting the two parties apart. Okay. So, review. I've told you essentially two things. The first is how to quantify the uncertainty in your environment. Okay. I have a guessing game. Which document is it? Which word is it going to be? Is it bird, tree, or car? Okay. and you quantify that using information theory, you can think of it as the average number of yes-no questions needed to answer or needed to guess if you're an optimal reasoner. Okay? And I've told you what a signal is now. A signal is something that reduces your uncertainty. You're uncertain about something. Okay? I tell you, I give you a signal. Your uncertainty has gone down. The extent to which your uncertainty has gone down is the strength of your signal. Okay. So, any questions? You're free to interrupt and yell at me if you please. Yes, sir?
Sorry, I'm going back to the graph with the divergence between Labour and Conservatives.
Yeah.
I wasn't looking at it carefully enough.
Okay.
But is it possible to work out from that who's doing the moving?
You're great. It's great, right? So, okay, what I have shown you is, I haven't shown you. It's not possible to work out, right? Basically, I'm telling you one parameter, right? You can think about it, and we often do this, right? We think about these manifestos, let's say, or speeches or documents as living in a big space. All I've done is tell you about the distance between these points. They could be doing this, right? They could be moving around, right? And in fact, of course, we know, for example, that Labour is moving around, right? And so we don't know, for example, if Labour is staying here and the Conservatives are breathing in and out. That, thank you, is an interpretation, right? And I rely, this is not peer-reviewed research, just an example to get you guys into it, right? So I rely upon you guys to say, yeah, I buy that interpretation, Simon, right? Like, my sense is that the Conservatives didn't do much, but there was this big moment. And so really what's happened is Labour got closer to the Conservatives. But it's an excellent question, absolutely. So I've only told you one part of this gigantic space that political discourse lives in. I've just measured this one quantity, right? And so you might imagine, right, like this moment here, right? Okay, that could be because Labour got closer to the Conservatives, or the Conservatives got closer to Labour. We don't know who's biting who. All right, so let's return to John Martin and Mary Hall. Okay. And what we're going to do, in particular, is study the relationship between two processes. The state-sanctioned category, the indictment type, right? Mary Hall tried for grand larceny. The relationship between this category here and ordinary speech. What we're going to ask is, to what extent does the spoken text of the trial, does the language that people actually used in the Old Bailey, right? To what extent does the spoken text of the trial signal what the government thinks has happened? Okay. And we're going to focus on the distinction between violent and nonviolent actions. So our fundamental question is extremely simple. Okay? I walk into a courtroom. I hear a single word. Right? I'm just sort of walking through the Old Bailey, and a word comes through an open door. I hear a single word. How much does that reduce my uncertainty about the kind of trial that's happening in that room? Okay. How much does what ordinary people say signal what the state thinks has happened? How much do these two things align? And we can do this, of course, and I suppose I am assuming you guys know this massive achievement that has happened, which is the digitization of over 200,000 trials from the Old Bailey. In particular, we have, well, it's not just OCR, but 10 types, so we actually have you can actually read these in XML format. Okay? But we have both the classification of the crime, and this is a different trial, this is Sarah Quinlan and Daniel Hughes. We have the classification of the crime, Sarah Quinlan in this case indicted for stealing, and then we have the spoken text of the crime itself. And what we're going to ask is, to what extent does this spoken text signal the indictment type? Okay. So here is the civilizing process, or the biological aspect of the civilizing process. Here is the declining murder rate. What we're going to do is look at the cultural change that happens in this little span here. Right? And it looks little on this graph, but this graph is like 1,000 years. Okay. We're going to go, in other words, from 1760 up until 1913, and our data end in 1913 for lots of interesting and complicated historical reasons. Okay? So we're going to deal, in the end, with on the order of 100,000 trials, a subset of the Old Bailey, and we're asking, what is the strength of the signal here of this? Or conversely, and equivalently, what is the strength of the signal here of this? So I'm going to show you a graph. This is like a big moment in my life. I remember when Sarah brought this in, and I remember being so excited about this. This is the strength. It's exactly the same kind of graph I showed you for the distinguishability of Labour versus Conservative over the course of a couple decades in English politics, or British politics. What I'm going to show you now is the change in uncertainty, the change in signal strength over time from 1760 up until 1913. the signal strength of ordinary language for the category used by the state. Here it is. We call this the cultural ratchet of the civilizing process. All you need to know about this graph, okay, is that this blue line here is the data, okay? This is a particular one we'll talk about in a second, and this here is the null model. Okay? This blue line goes up steadily in a long-term secular process. So, for example, when our data begin, let's take 1780, when our data begin in 1780, there is in fact no signal at the word level of the indictment type. If you hear a word being spoken in a courtroom of the Old Bailey, it doesn't tell you, it gives you no information about the nature of the indictment, okay, at that word level. And over time, however, a signal emerges and strengthens and seems to never come back. We call it the cultural ratchet of the civilizing process. That's my language. We weren't allowed to put ratchet in the title of the paper because our peer reviewers said, well, it doesn't say it's never going to go back down. We can't prove that. We can't prove that this signal will persist and continue to grow. Right? But what we see here, in parallel to the declining rate of homicide, this is the English data here, in parallel to the declining rate of homicide, we have what we might call an emerging genre of violence. As the crime rate declines, okay, which is something we've known about for many years now, as the crime rate declines, as London becomes a safer place, at the same time, people become more able to generate signals of violence. They're able to talk about violence, and the way they talk about violence aligns with the categories that the state uses. So there's a couple things you might wonder here, right? The signals in the courtroom are getting more and more specific, in other words. We can now distinguish violent and nonviolent crimes, for let's say 1820, right? So one question you might have is that, is it just because people are just getting more sort of fussy? Okay? Are they creating distinctions everywhere? Are all of the trials becoming more distinctive from each other? Here's a graph. This is just over time here. Here's a graph of the distinguishability of violent theft, okay, from the category of deception, so fraud, from the category of theft, and from the other category, which turns out to be mostly offenses against public goods like coining and treason and poaching. Okay. So we see, when we zoom in, that, for example, the way people talk about theft and theft with violence becomes increasingly distinct over time. The way people talk about violent theft and deception becomes increasingly distinct. And in fact, the way people talk about these other sort of more sort of miscellaneous offenses becomes more distinctive over time. But we don't see a corresponding signal in the distinctiveness between, let's say, deception and theft. There's no increase in signal between nonviolent crimes, and there's no increase in signal, it turns out, between violent crimes, but rather the two categories separate out. The signal emergence, in other words, is not due to increasing refinement. It's not because people are better note takers. The signals that are being created are signals that are specifically distinguishing the violent and the nonviolent actions. It's not simply because people, let's say, are talking longer or being more particular in the way that they are talking. Okay. One thing worth noting, right, is that most of the crime in the Old Bailey does not rise to murder. So the yellow line here is the murder indictments as a fraction of the total. This purple line here is the manslaughter indictments, right? So about 80% of the trials that we're tracking here are violence that doesn't rise to the level of murder. This is violence, in other words, that's invisible to the demographic and mortality rate studies. Okay? We can call this, in other words, the dark matter of 19th century violence. Right? People are not only distinguishing, they're not only recognizing murder as a particularly heinous act, okay? But they're also recognizing these milder forms of violence, violent theft, assault, the most common ones. We can do the same thing we did with the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and ask what particular signals are driving this, what particular kinds of words are driving this, what words, in other words, are the strongest signals of violence, and what words are the strongest signals of theft and deception, the nonviolent actions. Okay? And you find a couple things. In the case of theft, what you find is a shift in the nature of theft over time. Early in the history of the Old Bailey, the crimes that are passing through there, the crimes that make up the majority, are crimes involving mostly pickpocketing. Right? And so words associated with clothing and pockets show up. Over time, and in part correlated with a change in jurisdiction and a change in the kinds of crimes that the Old Bailey is empowered to take care of, what we see is a shift to an increasingly abstract nature of theft. Theft now involves not taking something physically from somebody's body, but forging banknotes, forging bills, forging checks. We can also ask, what are the strongest signals on the violent side? What are the signals of a violent action, right? So the first thing is, okay, if somebody dies, everyone's already using that as a signal, right? Murder, if you hear the word, let's say, deceased, dead, those words indicating that somebody was actually killed, right, are already signals. They just tend to be rare. So they're there, but they're not common enough to really be a strong enough signal to drive that distinctiveness, okay? But when it happens, it's there, okay? What we also see, however, is new words showing up that distinguish violent crimes that show an increasing attention to milder forms of violence, okay? So for example, words involving knives, cutting somebody, slashing somebody, if somebody mentions a dagger, right? In the 1770s and the 1780s, that's not a good signal of a crime for violence. But over time, if a knife shows up in a courtroom, everyone has decided that that crime is a crime of violence. And in fact, a little bit later, after we get the signal, after we get the emergence of the signal associated with knife violence, with sharpness, right, cutting things, we also get a signal associated with being hit and punched and kicked. We also find, actually, there's one, this will come a little bit later, we also have a new excuse emerges. So when people talk about being drunk by the end of our data set, that implies, or that's a signal of a crime of violence. It seems that people talk about being drunk, well, it seems like they're always drunk in the 1780s, okay? By the time you get to the 1900s, if someone says, I wasn't sober, it indicates that that's a trial for violence. People are using excuses now in a very particular way. They're explaining away behavior. Okay. So I will not actually dig into the, okay, no, we'll go on. Sorry. This is fun. It's, when I first talked to Tim about this work, we were talking about how to categorize the words. And one of the things we wanted to know was, is there a difference, or where is the information being carried in the trial? And one of the things you might be concerned about is the use of synonyms. Words that might mean the same thing, but like subtle shifts in the way, for example, different classes might use words. So do I talk about a bill or a coin or my purse, for example, right? And so what we're able to do is we can use empirically validated categories, so we can actually group words together into big classes. So instead of working at the word level, as I did with the labor and conservative, I can work at this more abstract level. And so we don't actually see the difference between purse and coin. We kind of coarse grain them into a single term, in that case, money. And in fact, we can keep coarse graining up the tree. You can think of this in some sense as the question tree, right? And we can just cut the questions off at a certain point, okay? Fortunately, when we did this and checked, right, where is the signal being carried, right? Where is the signal of the civilizing process? It happens both, in fact, in the broad distinctions and in the fine-grained distinctions, okay? So it happens both in the level of particular word choice, but also in the general categories of word choice that people are doing. So what we see over time here, the claim is, right, that we see an increasing alignment between speech and state. At the beginning here, right, the government already has a notion of violence. The government is always concerned to regulate violence. It's something we get, in fact, from Elias, right? For Elias, the civilizing process begins in the 1400s, when the state gains absolute power, when in fact it's no longer a negotiation, but you have in some sense kind of a Hobbesian sovereign sitting up there at the top. Right? At least that's his account of European history. Okay. So the state has already been concerned to regulate violence, and in fact the state's already been successful under this process. Right? It's already able to drop the murder rate by at least a factor of 10. Okay. It's done so, if we're right here, it's done so without the agency of ordinary people. But what we see in the data here now is the emergence of a distinction that perhaps already existed at the level of the state, but now exists also at the level of ordinary people trying to go about their lives, right? And so you might say that we can see the final stage of the civilizing process, right? We go from courtesy to civility. That's Elias's transition, okay? But now, in fact, we go to a final stage where ordinary people also appear to share these categories, make use of them at least, in prosecuting the people who offended them. Any questions before we cross the channel? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what was the ordinary language signals? Was it just the defense statement or all witness statements? Or
So, great. Okay, right. So the Old Bailey records include, at least after 1778, they include a supposedly perfect and fair transcription of what was said. Now, That's not true, right? There's a lot of stuff that's missing in those records. But at least after 1778, John Wilkes, the Mayor of London, actually hires some transcriptionists, spends some money on it, makes it a crime to, or rather, states that sexing up a transcript is a crime against the court. So before 1778, we can see this a little bit in our data, they make the crimes look more interesting. Okay. But after 1778, there's some kind of bureaucratic regularity there. Okay? And what we think we're getting is some sample of what people are actually saying. So I know Adam Crimble is working on the Irish case. So you look, and some of the transcripts actually have like really offensively done Irish accents, right? So it's like it's almost in dialect, right? Like it feels sort of super racist. And there's also a couple French, like sort of fake phonetic transcriptions of French. It's supposedly what people said. I say supposedly because, of course, there were no tape recorders running. One of the reasons, one of the data set we used was actually chosen in part by a group of linguists led by Magnus Huber. They're interested in using these transcripts as just a trace of the evolution of language over time. They're not interested in the government of the state. So what I'm saying is we think we have a transcript. We know it's imperfect, okay? And we sort of obsess about it a lot. One of the things I remember when I first started working with Tim, we were finding a couple signals here and there, and Tim was like, ooh, who's the stenographer? You have to check the front page and see if the stenographer changed, because maybe one guy is better at taking down, certain kinds of speech than others. We don't find those signals, and in fact, one of the things that makes me, I can get up and say this, is that this runs for 150 years. It's a straight line. I mean, it has these fluctuations. We don't know what they are. Are they noise? Who knows? Right? But the fact that this is consistently rising, right, without any clear breaks, these two lines here show one of the, a pair of the many, many possible breaks that could have happened because of procedural changes. We don't see that. What we see is this gradual, I get to say ratchet because I'm not being peer reviewed right now, this gradual pulling apart of violent and nonviolent trials, this gradual creation of a signal. Okay, yes?
Is it just common sense or interpretation that you're saying that the speech aligns to the state rather than the other way around, or is it evidenced in the data?
Great. Well, this is the most important question. I hope we'll get to this in the question section, right? I'm giving you facts, and I'm also telling you a story. So where do the facts about signals end and the interpretations begin? So the fact is, right, there is a fact here of a word gives you a signal about an indictment. So does that mean that people are conforming themselves to the categories created by the state? Now that's interpretation, right? What we do know is that the way people speak is telling us about the kind of crime that the government has registered in its books. That I can say is a fact. Everything else is where we work together. All right, so great, let's make fun of the French. I hear this is popular. At least here. Let's talk about the French Revolution. This is a separate project, and it is at the same time a project about how people talk. In this case, it's a project about how the elites talk. So I'll give you a brief primer on the French Revolution. From a physicist, right? 1789, Louis XVI convenes the Estates General. The last time this had happened was 1614, so nobody knows what's going to happen. Many things have happened between 1614 and 1789. 1,200 people show up. It's the largest sort of eventually democratic decision-making body that has been convened in Europe. It's 3 times larger than the British Parliament, and it's very much larger than the 53 founding American fathers. Within 5 years, the system collapses into terror, but in the preceding period, what people do is, for the first time, try to negotiate and discuss and talk about what it would mean and how to go about creating a state not run by a single sovereign. Okay? They debate this, and in fact, we have the records of those debates. And again, like the Old Bailey records, these are very imperfect, but in fact, French historians in the 19th century and then later in the 20th century, they kind of gave up in the 19th century and then started the project again in the 20th century, which is really a pity because the stuff in the 20th century is still in copyright, so we can't do it. But fortunately, we do get the sort of blow by blow, as best they can, historical reconstruction from the minutes, okay, of what people said from moment to moment. Okay, so everything that Mirabeau says. If you read this, actually, right, you have the great speeches about, like, what is the nature, right, of taxes? How should we see? Actually, it's funny he chose taxes. How should we understand taxes? What is the right of a citizen? How much right does a citizen have to dictate the nature of the expense that they are paying in to the state? They do a lot of things, though. They also argue about the minutes. in exhausting detail. So one way to think of this is as the world's worst faculty meeting that runs for 5 years and then everyone gets killed at the end. And in fact, so this is, I mean, my French is not perfect, right? But this is okay. We're going to read the minutes from yesterday, and then the bishop said, I would like to object because you've described this monastery as giving a gift, and actually it's not a gift of patriotism because they can't give the gift, right? And they're going back and forth. Then a nobleman from the Second Estate shows up and he says, I just want to say that just because everyone's applauding right now, it doesn't mean that that he's right. So here's another one. This is when things begin to break down, and actually in the first assembly, the National Constituent Assembly, which we'll focus on here, and you can see these people here are kind of getting into an argument about who gets to speak next. And at the end, the president says, if the discussion is going to continue, Robespierre will have the floor. Right? Bad idea. So the first thing we did, actually, when we started this was with Alexander Barron, who's a graduate student at Indiana, and Rebecca Spang, who is a French historian who we have roped in our sort of physicist sandwich. The first thing I just speak is great, right? We're going to go in, we're going to look at the emergence of signals of left versus right, mission accomplished, we go home, simple, done, like 3 months, okay? It didn't turn out that way. So let me show you, though, this is sort of the equivalent of that Labour Party, Conservative Party diagram here. What we're doing, I'm going to show you the distinguishability of individuals in the National Constituent Assembly, so the elites representing the 3 estates. I'm going to take each individual, and I'm going to measure the average distance from one individual to the next as a function of political affiliation, left or right, gauche and droite. Okay? So I'll walk you through this graph step by step here. So the bottom line here, the dashed line, is the average distance between two members of the assembly who are both, as categorized by Rebecca very well, with lots of double checks, I promise. The average distance between two members categorized is on the right, the droite, DD. So this is the DD signal. This is the average distance between two speakers, right, on the right. And up here, this solid line is the average distance between two speakers on the left. Okay? So there's lots of fun things you can see here. First of all, right, one simple thing you can see is that two left-wing speakers are further apart from each other than two right-wing speakers are. Right? The left is kind of all over the place, right? And the right is more, you might say, coherent. Well, that's interpretation, right? It's harder to tell the difference between two right-wing speakers than it is between two left-wing speakers. Okay? You can see, so the sad thing is, I was just hoping this stuff was just going to go up. It's be really simple, like the Old Bailey, right? Just a steady line going. It's kind of all over the place. I'll point your attention to two interesting moments in the Revolution. The two anniversaries of the fall, the first two anniversaries of the Bastille. So here's the first one. Okay. And what you can see is that the first anniversary was a pretty celebratory thing. It's like, we did a good thing, well done us, right? And so in fact, you can see that the left wing is actually pretty closer together. So here is before the first anniversary, and here's just after. What you can see is like the left kind of got a little closer together, kind of huddled in, right? And the way they're using language is less distinctive than it was before. Okay? Here's the second anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. This is a much more somber anniversary because Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution at least, has now, in an attempt to suppress a riot on behalf of some of the left wing, has actually had them shot. It's a bit like a Wilkes and the Gordon riots. Okay? So the response here, in fact, is that the gauche-gauche, the left-left, has split apart. They're further apart from each other than they are sort of on average. So here, the first anniversary is celebratory, they're close together. Okay, here, the second anniversary, they're further apart. Okay. So what's the third line? Right? This is the distance between the left and the right. Okay? So this line here, I'm going to touch your screen, I'll clean it up afterwards, right? This line here, right, is the distinguishability of two left-wing people. This line here is the distinguishability of two right-wing people. And here's the distinguishability of a left-wing person and a right-wing person. So what's kind of crazy here, right, is that two left-wing party members, or sort of two left-wing speakers in the assembly, are more different from each other than they are from an average member of the right wing. So how does that work? What's the geometry there? How is it possible for two people on the same side, okay, to be more different from each other than they are different from a member on the opposite side? So let's just draw this out, right? Let's put the right wing, just put a couple guys down on the board here, right? So this is like the right wing, right? And they're kind of close together, right? So it turns out, of course, that politics is not a line. And really, the way that you should understand this system is like this. At the center are all the right-wing speakers, right? And what happens is the left is not some isolated body sitting over here, right? Certainly geometrically in the actual revolution, right? We call them left and right because they were sitting on one side and the other. But in fact, ideologically, in terms of the signals they create, right? In terms of the signals they create, in fact, you can think of this gigantic sort of left-wing suburb around the right-wing core. Okay. What this is allowing us to do is, in other words, to figure out the geometry of the signals that people create, each of these points here being a person. And yeah, right, if you're on the left, you'll find some people like you on the left, right? If you're in a suburb, there's suburbs around you. But there's also suburbs all the way on the other side that you're really far away from. Conversely, and this is something that Rebecca and I, when we sort of talk about this, she's like, well, the right are just sitting there astride history, saying non, right? What they do is a lot simpler than what the left wing is trying to do. Okay. So we don't know how these things evolve over time. It would be lovely to draw a plot that goes straight from 1789 to 2016. Okay? We can, eventually, and one of the things that we're thinking about doing actually is applying this to the problem of Eastern Europe. So after Eastern Europe is released from Soviet control, they start to form parliaments. They start to form democratic, or at least plausibly democratic, systems of governance. Okay. So I'll talk about now the second thing we can do with the French Revolution, which is a shift from a story about innovation, all right, to a story about surprise. What we're going to do in the time we have remaining is to talk about the structure of how new ideas are introduced into the French Revolution. So I'll introduce one more concept here, which is how to measure the surprise of a distribution. We can talk about this in terms of something we call coding failure. So let's go back to our optimal questions, right? You guys were good at this, right? You figured out how to construct the optimal questions if your dad is playing the guessing game with you, right? He guesses car quite a bit, okay? So ask, is it a car first? But let's say you're expecting your father, you actually get your mother, and your mother has a different distribution. Now, let's say your mother is weighted more towards tree than car. Now, all of a sudden, even though she has the same level of uncertainty as your father, you're just as uncertain about what she's going to say, the question structure that you came up with is non-optimal. Optimally, if you ask a different set of questions, it would take 1.5 as before. In fact, now with what we call dad encoding, right, it's less efficient. You're asking the wrong questions in the wrong order. Okay. So coding failure, it's called Kullback-Leibler divergence, right? Coding failure estimates or allows you to measure how much a new distribution violates your expectations about what has come before. And in fact, interesting, this is something that we know a little bit about in the lab. If you look at how people watch a film, right, you take a video clip, you can measure the uncertainty in any patch. So in any little patch for a certain period of time, the pixels will fluctuate. Okay? So there's a certain level of uncertainty. And so here's just an example of people playing football here, right? Okay? So here's the entropy level. White means more uncertain. So you can see like there's this big field of grass here. The grass is waving back and forth, right? Sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's light. It's a very uncertain color, or a very uncertain shade. Okay? We can also look at the level of surprise. Okay? So we know the grass is fluctuating back and forth. So we know it's 50-50 white and black, and that never changes. And so in fact, that's not surprising. It's uncertain, but unsurprising. Okay? But up here where the players are running about, okay, now all of a sudden, right, your expectations at one point are violated by what you see next, and you see this hot spot here of surprise in the video clip. Okay. In fact, if you track how people look at the screen, they in fact attend directly to the source of surprise. Okay. So this is the level of information theoretic surprise in the video clip. This is the patch of the screen with the greatest surprise, where the probability distribution from one moment to the next changes. Okay. And here's where people look. So we can do this in the French Revolution. We can measure the Kullback-Leibler divergence, the level of surprise from one speech to the next. So you hear a speech, you hear a set of signals, you hear a set of words, okay? Does the next speech use the same signals and the same words, or does it use different ones, right? Okay? If it's a speech that follows naturally from the one that came before, right, it's low KL, low Kullback-Leibler divergence. Conversely, a speech where the surprise is high, right, we can call a particularly surprising speech. And so now we can track over the course from one speech to the next in the French Revolution, from one speech to the next, the level of surprise that you get. Okay. We call this the speech-to-speech surprise. And so just to give you one more chance at it, right? Given the probability distribution I've just learned, how surprised am I by what comes next? How badly does my encoding scheme fail on the new text? Very simple. So here it is, right? Here is the sort of scribble plot. This is the sort of EKG of surprise in the French Revolution. We have 34,000 speeches made over the course of them writing the Constitution, right? Scribbles like this. So at some points, right, there'll be a speech like, whoa, totally unexpected. The person before you was using this set of words, this set of signals. The next person comes along, right, and it's completely different. The kinds of words he's using are completely different. So we see the scribble over time. So what's interesting, okay, don't worry, I'll zoom in here, right? What's interesting is that the average surprise does not change that much. The average surprise from month to month doesn't change. But what does change is the surprise variance. So at the beginning, you sort of have an average surprise of 3 bits in this case, right? That doesn't change. But as time goes on, the scribbles get more wild. What's happening here, okay, is that some people, there'll be a speech, and there'll be another speech that's not surprising at all. It'd be like, I'm talking, like, computers are great, we should just, throw out the humanists, just only have computers. And then James says, I absolutely agree, computers are just the greatest thing ever. And then Tim comes in and he says, what about human meaning and what it means to be a person? This is awkward silence, right? That was a high surprise moment, right? High surprise, right? Sort of awkward silence, and then James is like, computers, right, guys? Computers. Okay, great. Another high surprise moment. James is kicked back in, and then I jump in, right? So what we're seeing here, right, is that the discourse, how people are talking, right, it becomes increasingly entrained. So instead of this, you now get like that. Okay? It's the story of the French Revolution, or at least one perspective on it. How people are putting together the discourse. And what we're finding is that people are entraining or anti-entraining with each other as time goes on. Okay. So we can track one other thing, which is not from one speech to the next, okay, but from one speech to everything that's come before. So what I've shown you there was how the discussion went moment to moment. Time t plus 1, time t plus 2. We can also ask, how does one speech, or to what extent does one speech introduce something that has never been seen before? To what extent does one speech innovate over the entire history of the discussion so far? We call this speech to past. Given the full history of everything I've encountered, how surprised am I by what happens next? And in fact, you see the same curve. So the average rate of innovation, the average rate of the introduction of new words, new signals, stays constant. Okay? But the variance gets higher. So what's happening now is in the later part of the French Revolution, people are talking. They're not introducing things that are unheard of before, except occasionally there's something really new that hasn't been seen. Okay? So again, you see this kind of square wave structure that emerges. Originally, people are talking. There's sort of new things as a gradual bubble, but now it starts to flatten and become extreme. Okay? And we can ask a question like this, right? Does something innovative disrupt the system? Does a high speech-to-past surprise predict high downstream speech-to-speech surprise? So somebody says something that hasn't been heard before in the room. What does that do to the conversation? And in fact, what we find, we'll just do some like classic old-school multiple linear regression here, like old-school econometrics, right? What we find is that when there is an innovation, when somebody introduces something that's surprising given what's happened before, the system becomes disoriented. We call this innovation turbulence. Conversely, okay, we can ask, what is the response to external events? That's the response to internal events. Somebody says something that hasn't been heard before. What do people do? Okay? But we can also look at the system response to external events, so significant events in the outside world or significant moments in the National Assembly itself. Okay? And in fact, it actually goes the other way. And so controlling for all of the nuisance variables, what we find is that on a day where something big happens, so on a day when Lafayette shoots revolutionaries, on a day where the King of France attempts to flee the country, the flight to Varennes, he almost gets out, and they catch him and bring him back. Okay? The major moments in the French Revolution, okay, actually suppress novelty in the room. It's actually the opposite of what we see in, let's say, the financial markets. So in a financial market, right, event-driven, something big happens in the outside world, the market becomes turbulent. In fact, discussion, the parliament, is information-driven. The volatility, the surprise rate in a discussion is actually driven by internal events. When something crazy, something significant, something historically significant happens in the outside world, okay, it actually suppresses the rate of innovation. Right? So we study hundreds of thousands of trials. Right? We study tens of thousands of speeches. Okay? Why? Why do it? Right? I think there are three big answers. The first is, and I think the most important reason is, that it is a way to enrich the humanities. It gives us a new window into historical events. For me to be able to say that the way the French Revolution happens, one of the things that happens is that speeches either entrain or disassociate from each other, and that increases over time. That's a story, that's a set of facts that could, if you wish, inform an interpretation. It does not force an interpretation, but it's something that I think historians should be interested in wrestling with. The second thing, actually, and this has struck me, right, is that I think there is a new role for theory in the humanities. Right? Because when we do this, we're completely at sea. We have no idea what we're doing. One of the big texts for me, in the case of the French Revolution, was an article by William Sewell at University of Chicago, who says, what is an event? Like this super theoretical article, because I'm trying to study a system in this incredibly abstract way. I need theories. In fact, I remember Sarah and I we read Foucault. For us, was a way to think about what a signal might mean. Okay? And finally, I think there are new impacts for humanities research. That in order to do this kind of work, in order to say, is Parliament like a market? We have to have historians of the French Revolution to guide us. We can't do this work unless people have understood or helped us understand the French Revolution. So another way to think of it is that if you're doing history and we're doing this, you help us. The work that you're doing to interpret and help us understand these events now pays off in a completely new domain that might perhaps be unexpected to you. I think the second reason is that there are new challenges for the sciences, right? So I hang out with cognitive scientists a lot, right? What they do is they put people in a lab and say, which do you like, lemons or apples, right? Here's an undergraduate, are you going to cheat them to get $5, right? But how do people behave when the stakes are high? How do they behave when they're really high? How do they behave when they're under threat of death? How do they behave when a third of their yearly salary has been stolen? How do they behave when they're trying to build a new society? There's only one way to get that answer, okay? And that's to look into the historical archives. And it's a new challenge. I don't think scientists know. We don't have good ideas about how people behave in these really extreme environments when they're trying to do something that nobody has ever seen before, right? So the standard test of creativity is like, here's a use, come up with as many uses of a pencil that you can, right? Well, here, right, what's Mirabeau doing, right? Come up with as many uses as you can for the state, right? We go beyond money, right? So we have been able to quantify things in the past. We've been able, in particular, to quantify economics, right? But now, hopefully, we can go beyond the study of money in the past, and we can study the ideas and the culture and the rhetoric of the past. Okay? And finally, I think there's a new challenge for the sciences, right? Not only do we have to develop something beyond economics to understand how to quantify these things, but we also have to go beyond the disciplines. We have to understand how the social sciences and the political sciences and the cognitive sciences interact. Finally, and I think most importantly, is the public benefit. Janet Brown, I didn't get to tell you about Darwin. Janet Brown wrote a huge biography of Darwin. What we think we can do with the Darwin archive is extract signals of major intellectual events in his life. By studying the flow of surprise, by studying the Kolbach-Leibler divergence in his reading patterns, what we think we can do is identify moments where he decides that he's going to do something big. Okay? Not everybody gets a 2-volume biography by Janet Brown. In fact, only one person has so far. But if we understand, if we can calibrate our models on elites, we can transfer them to the ordinary people in this world. What we can do, for example, is stick our email into the same kind of analysis. We can stick the minutes of the Bloomington Faculty Council, which is what Rebecca wants to do. Excuse me. If we understand the French Revolution, we can use it to understand the more ordinary events that permeate our lives. The second thing is, I think, is that the people gathered this data. The archives we have because they were preserved by people who were not working scientists. They were people caught up in a bureaucracy in the case of the Old Bailey. In the case of the French Revolution, they were people, many of whom who ended up dying for the cause of democracy. And then finally, we have a problem. The problem is big data is coming. Okay? People are going to analyze human behavior quantitatively. They are going to take our records, and they're going to look at them, and they're going to put numbers on them. There's no way to stop it. Okay? Google knows that your son lost his virginity before you do. Google probably knows that your son's gay before your son knows, right? They know, the data, the level of data they have is incredible, and there's just no legislation that's going to prevent it. And so what I might say is that what we need is not a movement against big data, but we need the people in the humanities. We need you guys to help us tame it. We need you to help us understand how the significant events, the meaningful events in people's lives show up in this data, not just the economic events. How we can trace things like values and morality through a big data archive, and not just how we can sell better ads. So it remains for me, finally, just to thank my collaborators, Sarah Klingenstein, who was the graduate student leading the Old Bailey project, and Tim, of course. In the French Revolution case, it's Alexander Baran as the graduate student wrestling with a data set that I wish Sheffield and Tim would work on because Stanford can't really do as good a job. Rebecca Spang is our historian leading us, and Jenny is an undergraduate who's helped with some of the data work. I didn't get a chance to talk about Jamie and Colin's work. One thing you will notice about this slide is a sign of being living in England is that you don't smile. So everybody else is happy. I'm not sure why Tim is not. I'm very grateful you have let me go over, and I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.